So the homework from last week, from between section 5 and section 6, was to take a look at or read or listen through the book of Revelation, and you get more out of it if you can do it in one sitting, but I'm not going to scold you or shame you for that if you had to push pause and come back to it. But there was some good observations. I know that on our group message board, some observations that were posted there, someone said, wow, I never knew that there were so many numbers in the book of Revelation. And we have some extra handouts right up here if you need some. Does anybody else need a handout? Wave at Joan and she'll be happy. She's just, I'm trusting that she's that kind of wonderful person. She'd be happy to give it to you. Okay. There's also great observations that we noticed that there's 7 letters to 7 churches and 7 seals and 7 trumpets and 7 bowls that are in there. That's part of the observations of the arrangement of the book. Anybody else that listened to it that noticed something that you'd like to share real quick? I might have covered it. Yeah, yes, Joan. Yeah. In many ways. Okay. Okay, Joan, I'm going to repeat you for the sake of the video. Joan observed that it seems to be a rehashing of the entire Old Testament, especially the prophetic books, and that it doesn't appear to be in an order that goes in what we would consider to be a straight line. That's a great observation. And I saw another hand on this direction. Yes, ma'am.
I felt like it flowed as you read the whole thing at once.
As you read the whole thing at once, there was a flow. There was an order, but it wasn't like a linear order. There was a different kind of order. Great observations. Yes, David.
I kept seeing triplets.
Not only groups of 7.
Who he is, what's good, what's wrong, and what's come on board.
Okay, what's good, what's wrong, and what you need to do about it.
Sure.
Yeah. What's good, what's bad, what you need to do about it.
The joke is I've opened the door, so I'm not worried about Revelation.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David. That's a good observation. All right. Now, to dive into today, I want to go back and recap what we covered so far. And I gave you one blank just to keep you engaged here, staying with me. But 6 weeks ago, we started with the starting point. And we learned that studying Revelation will shape the way that we understand Jesus. It shapes the way we understand Jesus's kingdom. It shapes the way that we understand our own lives. And so there's value in our study of the book of Revelation. In week 2, we learned about the setting, the historical setting, that it was written to 7 real churches in a land called Asia Minor that today would be called Turkey. And it was at a real time. That would be the end of the 1st century, probably in the middle 90s, maybe around 95 AD or so. And it was written to those people in those churches who were experiencing conflict. That's the key word. There is conflict between the Christians and the Jews. There's conflict between the Christians and the Romans. There's conflict between God and Satan. And all of the conflict is making life difficult for those Christians. A few weeks ago, when I was going through that lesson, I mentioned that there was an early church father who said that it happened during the reign of Domitian. And then like in between services, someone caught me and said, "What early church father?" And my answer was, well, if I knew his name, I would have said it, and I wouldn't have said the early church father. But I did my homework. It's Eusebius. So if I don't remember who asked me that question, or if you're maybe the person who's asking me is watching on video, but now you know it was an early church father named Eusebius. Okay. And then the third lesson was about the sources, that John uses hundreds of allusions. An allusion is not a direct quote. It's not saying, "Thus says the prophet Isaiah." It is an allusion, is just a little tiny word, a little tiny phrase that should bring back an idea that comes from the Old Testament. And those ideas are encouraging that audience of those 7 churches so that they can endure and that they can overcome as they live through similar circumstances as the circumstances that God's people lived in back in the Old Testament times, that there's parallels between their experience and the experience of God's people back during the days of Jeremiah and Daniel and the Exodus. And then the next lesson there was about the symbols and how John used symbols from the Old Testament Roman culture to give a literal meaning through a figurative image. And so the words literal and figurative don't really actually help us, because the answer is both. There is a literal meaning, but there's also a figure that is symbolic that helps us to understand what that literal meaning is. So maybe a better way of describing it is we want to look at the natural meaning of the text. So that was kind of the wrap up of the lesson last week. Now we're going to dive in to the next level, and it's going to be called the structure of the book of Revelation. And some of you made great observations about the structures of the book of Revelation as you listen to the book in one setting. But before we get to structure in the book of Revelation, I want to just walk you through the fact that almost every book of the Bible has some kind of clear structure. And maybe you've never seen these before, but I think they're really cool. So here's some examples. If you read through the book of Genesis, you might see in your English translation a little phrase, "These are the days." You'll see that, especially if you read it through the NASB or the King James. In other translations, it might not be quite as obvious, but there's a Hebrew word behind that English phrase, toledot. And that Hebrew word appears in Genesis 2, 5, 6, 10, 11, 27, chapter 25, verse 9, chapter 36, chapter 39, and I skipped out of order there, chapter 37. But you can tell that there's quite a few different times where that little phrase, "these are the days," or the Hebrew word toledot, appears. And if you were to ask the author of Genesis, Moses, "How did you organize your book?" he'd say, "Didn't you see? It was obvious right there." Also, keep in mind, the authors of Scripture did not create the chapter and verse breaks that we have. Those came along during the Middle Ages by a guy named Stephen Langdon and another guy named Robert Estienne. And those guys in the Middle Ages created the chapter and verse breaks. Sometimes they put them in the right spot. Many times they did not. And you've noticed that as you've read through, like, why did the chapter break here? The funny story is that they made the breaks as they were riding their horse across Europe, and whenever their pencil hit the paper, that's where they decided to break the chapter. And sometimes it seems like it's that arbitrary. But those chapter and verse breaks are not in the minds of the author. The author has his own structure in mind, and every time he says "these are the days," that's the author of Genesis saying new chapter. I'm going to talk about the days of a new character. Then you go to the book of Acts. Acts has a structure that is somewhat similar. If you read Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Luke, the author, outlines the entire structure of the book of Acts. He says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And then you keep reading the book of Acts, and you realize that the focus of the book begins with all of the events that happen in Jerusalem. And then it zooms out a little bit more. And then you have events that are happening in Judea. And then it zooms out a little bit more. And you see events that are happening in Samaria. Now, if you're really paying attention, it zooms out a little bit more. And there's a level of events that happen in Caesarea or Antioch. Now, that's past Samaria, but it just says to the ends of the earth. But by the time you get to the end of the book of Acts, Paul is in Rome, to the ends of the earth. There's the structure, and that verse is the key to unlocking how the book of Acts flows. It does that on purpose. Okay. If you go to 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians is Paul's response to a letter that the Corinthian church sent him. We don't have that. We're just hearing half of a conversation. Like, the person that talks too loud on their phone at the pharmacy at Walgreens, they're having a conversation. You found out way too much about their personal life, and you don't know what's happening on the other side of the phone, but you know what's happening on their side of the phone. That's what 1 Corinthians is. We know what Paul is saying, and from that we can infer a little bit about what they asked. But there is a little phrase that appears throughout the book of 1 Corinthians, and you can see that for the most part, the guys who broke up the chapter and verses paid attention, but a couple times they didn't pay attention. So in 1 Corinthians 7:1, it says now concerning. And then 7:25, now concerning. And in 8:1, now concerning. 12:1, now concerning. 16:1, 16:12, now concerning. Why does he keep saying now concerning? Because when they wrote a letter to Paul, they had a list of questions, of issues that are going on in their church, and he's just responding and going down the list. That's kind of cool. I think that's really cool. So that's the structure of 1 Corinthians. You could go to the book of Matthew. Now, here's something that's really cool in the book of Matthew. There is a phrase after Jesus said these things. That phrase appears 5 times in the book of Matthew. It creates the structure of the book of Matthew. It appears in 7:28, the last verse of that chapter. 11:1, obviously the first verse of that chapter. 13:53, the last verse of that chapter. 19:1, the first verse. 26:1, the first verse. So the people who broke up the chapters and verses, they were close. Sometimes they put that little phrase at the end of a chapter, and sometimes they put that little phrase at the beginning of the chapter. But what's going on there? There are 5 major sermons, and if you keep track in the book of Matthew, sermon number 1 is the Sermon on the Mount. And the end of the Sermon on the Mount is chapter 7, verse 28. Then all of chapter 10 is the sermon of the commissioning of the 12 disciples. And so the next verse is the first verse of chapter 11. And then at the end of chapter 13, 13 is the sermon of parables of the kingdom. And 13:53 is the last verse of that sermon. Then chapter 19 is the verse that comes after, chapter 19, verse 1 is the verse that comes after all of chapter 18, which is the sermon on the church, on church discipline, and the parable of the unforgiving manager and other material like that in chapter 18, the sermon on the church. And then 26:1 is the verse that comes after chapter 24 and 25, which we call the Olivet Discourse, or the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. Okay, now, that's really cool that Matthew has clearly structured 5 sermons. In fact, Matthew is the least chronological of the 4 Gospels. Matthew will give us a historical story that appears later in Luke and Mark or John, but Matthew will put it earlier. Or a story that appears early in Mark, Luke, or John, Matthew will put it later. Why is Matthew doing that? Because he wants his narrative content to follow a certain sermon, so that the narratives flavor the sermons and the sermons will flavor the narratives. And it's not a chronological flow, it's a topical flow. Now, still the birth comes before the crucifixion and resurrection, obviously, but there's some rearranging material in between all of that. That's pretty cool to connect. Now, big picture, there's also another level here. Why would Matthew arrange his book around 5 major messages? Who else gave 5 really big messages? Do you know? Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Who else besides Jesus gave 5 really big messages? We call them the Pentateuch. Penta means 5. Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, Matthew, why couldn't you just say Jesus is like a new Moses? Because that's how we would want to say it, but he's Jewish. He doesn't just come out and say Jesus is a new Moses. He says, here comes a great teacher, and he has 5 big messages. That's a way. Do you see what I just pointed out there? The structure of the entire book of Matthew is structured in such a way that Matthew wants his readers to pick up on the idea that Jesus is the new Moses. And if you never picked up on that, you missed a big idea that Matthew has wanted us to know for thousands of years. That's what's going on in the book of Matthew. Now, the big point there, the structure taught us the point of the book. And often we miss things like that. Now, if that's what one of the 12 disciples does, would you be surprised if another one of the 12 disciples uses structures to write an entire book, and we find the points of the book in the hinges of the structures. Let that prepare us for as we walk into the book of Revelation. Now, we did a little bit of structuring the book of Revelation just a few weeks ago, and I gave you that extra handout where I put the 7 letters to the 7 churches, and I created them in parallel columns. And row by row, you could see the content that was parallel. If you didn't get that handout, there's extra ones right over here that you can grab on your way out today. But the parallel contents, or the church, the angel of the church, you can go back and just, you don't need to write this down because it's all on that handout. Just grab that handout. But we have content that's to the angel in the church. We have the words of Jesus. We have what Jesus knows about the church. Those are in all 7. And then in not all 7, but some of all 7, there's a part in the middle. Some of them got a pat on the back for positive endurance. Some of them got a kick in the pants for negative rebukes. Some of them got reminded of the consequences for not paying attention to the negative rebukes. And then some of them said, even though I'm giving you a negative rebuke, you need to know that not all of you are getting the negative rebuke. And then back to everyone, there was the victorious individuals, but the victorious individuals were before, listen, he who has ears, listen to the words of the Spirit. That was for the first 3 or 4 of the letters. And then for the last 3 or 4, it came after, listen, he who has ears, let him hear. But there's clear structure. Now, what the point of that structure is, so whether you are, when you get to the words of the victorious individuals, if you go back and read that in Ephesus, the victorious individuals, they will eat from the tree of life. Okay, that's good if you're living in Ephesus. But if you're a victorious individual in Pergamum, it says you will receive the hidden manna in the letter of Pergamum in chapter 2, verse 17. But if you're in the church of Laodicea, the victorious individual will sit on the throne with Jesus. Is there a difference between eating from the tree of life, receiving hidden manna, and sitting on the throne with Jesus? Is there a difference? No, there's not. They are parallel ways of saying, here's the promise. And it's just a different way of, here's a different angle of the promise that Jesus is giving you. So the victorious individuals get the same reward in Ephesus as the victorious individuals in Laodicea, but they're using different images to describe what that reward is like. It's not like the ones in Laodicea, well, you get to sit on the throne, but you're not going to get any hidden manna. Or the ones in Pergamum, like, okay, you get hidden manna, but you're not going to get to eat from the tree of life. No, they're all different images of what the rewards of eternal life are going to look like, but each of them highlights a bit of that reward, and it shows us that all of those rewards are parallel in some way. Yeah, just like in the beginning of those 7 letters, every one of the 7 churches had a vision of Jesus. It's the same Jesus. Yeah, it's the same reward, just a different angle of that reward. That tells us about how the book of Revelation is going to be structured. And the point of the book is found often in the structure. Okay, so what we just did, looking at the 7 letters of the 7 churches, we're now going to do for the whole book of Revelation. And the key to the structure, here's a big $20 word for you: recapitulation. Say it with me. Recapitulation. All right. Not that scary when you can say it out loud. Recapitulation. Now, we actually say this word way more often than we know. In fact, we already used it earlier today. Remember, it's on your handout already. It says recap. You know what recap is short for? Recap is short for recapitulation. Not only did we do that earlier, Ryan did that in a Sunday school class this morning. Your second slide in your Sunday school lesson this morning said recap. Recap is short for the recapitulation. We just went back and covered the bases that we've already covered. So we did that at the beginning of tonight's lesson, and we're going to do that. We're going to see that that is a key way that the book of Revelation organizes its structure. So recapitulation is a literary device used by an author to make a point through intensifying repetition. Okay, So intensifying repetition. At one of the churches where I used to serve back in Kansas, we had an elder who was a great harmonica player. And it was really impressive. So he played, it was one of the old hymns. I think it was an upbeat, it was a peppy hymn. I can't remember what it was, but he did the special music for the church one morning, and he played through the hymn and played each note with one breath. Okay. And then he played through the hymn a second time, and he played each note with two breaths, one out, one in. And it was the same, but it was a double note every time. And then he played through it a third time with three breaths, and then a fourth time. And by the end of it, like it was a slow hymn. By the end of it, it was everyone's heartbeat was going with it. Everyone's toes were tapping, and it was repetition, but it intensified every time. So you could hear the intensifying repetition. That is what we need to have in mind when we read through the book of Revelation. Those of you who listened to it, maybe you experienced, maybe I just gave words to describe what you experienced as you were listening to the whole book. Maybe if you didn't listen to it this last week, maybe you need to go back and listen to it. Now that you have these words to kind of put on it, that you were listening to recapitulation, you were listening to intensifying repetition throughout the whole book. So let me talk about recapitulation. Revelation did not invent it. We have recapitulation throughout the rest of the Bible. You read 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Old Testament. Well, they are a recap of 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. They tell the same story from a new angle. You can read the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, or you can recap them in Deuteronomy chapter 5 from a new angle. You can read the gospel in the book of Matthew, or you can recap them from a new angle by reading the gospel in Mark and in Luke. That we call those three together the lookalike gospels. The big word for that is the synoptic gospel. Synoptic just means lookalike. And here's another beautiful one that you might not have ever picked up on. That the story of Peter in the book of Acts is recapitulated. It is repeated and intensified by the story of Paul in the book of Acts. Peter heals a lame person. Paul heals a lame person. Peter has a miraculous release from prison. Paul has a miraculous release from prison. Peter raises someone from the dead. Paul raises someone from the dead. Peter is on trial before the Sanhedrin in one of the Herods. Paul is on trial before the Sanhedrin in one of the Herods. And guess what? You know all of those, how Paul is recapitulating what happened to Peter, but Peter is recapitulating what happened to Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Everything that happened to Jesus happens to Paul, and it happens to Peter, and happens to Paul. Now, you might say, well, where was the miraculous release of prison from Jesus? You remember several times where they went to try to stone him, but he slipped away. I'm going to count that. Okay, so there's that miraculous release. But that's all examples of where there's a lot of recapitulation throughout the Bible already, and we're familiar with that. So don't be surprised if it happens here in the book of Revelation. So let's talk about this recapitulation. If the book of Revelation is structured using recapitulation, then the structure is not linear or chronological. Maybe you have seen some people give their interpretations of Revelation and they try to plot the whole book on a linear timeline that has different events happening in order. We're going to point out, if you listen to the whole book, I mean, what Joan observed, it can't be in a linear timeline. You know why it can't be in a linear timeline? The end of the world happens in chapter 6. Okay? If the end of the world happened in chapter 6, we still have 16 more chapters to go. What's the point of 16 more chapters if the world already ended in chapter 6? Yeah. So I'll point this out in a moment, but I'll skip, then I'll come back. Here's chapter 6. They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Then here's verse 17. For the great day of their wrath. Whose wrath? The great day of the wrath of the Lamb and the wrath of the one who sits on the throne. The great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? Now, here's my question. What happens on the day after the great day of the wrath of the Lamb? 70 with a slight breeze and partly cloudy. There is no day after the day of the wrath of the Lamb. The day of the wrath of the Lamb is the end. There is no day after the day of the wrath of the Lamb. And that happens in chapter 6. So what's the rest of the book about? Let's look at it from another angle. Did you notice that not only does the end of the earth happen in chapter 6, but the end of the earth happens in chapter 6, just to back up here before I move on. Chapter 6 is seal number 6. The opening of the 6th seal. In chapter 5, there's a scroll with 7 seals. Each time a seal is popped off, judgments are unleashed. And when seal number 6 gets popped off by the Lamb, this is the end of seal number 6. There it is. So then we'll skip ahead. This is trumpet number 7. The 7th angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Just pause right there. What happens the day after the kingdom of the world becomes the kingdom of our Lord and Messiah? What's the day after that day? There is no day after that day. Not in the world as we know it, because the day that the kingdom of the world becomes the kingdom of our Lord and Messiah is the end of the world as we know it. Continuing on, you can go back and read it in context if you're concerned that I skipped a few verses, but for the sake of the space of the slide, it's just a little hymn in there. So verse 18, the nations were angry and your wrath has come. Not your wrath is coming, your wrath has come. Okay, what's the day after the day that the wrath of the Lamb has come? There is no day. The time for judgment of the dead. That's the last day, right? And for the rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both small and great, for destroying those who destroy the earth. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the Ark of the Covenant, and there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and an earthquake, and a severe hailstorm. That's the end, folks. That's all, folks. There's nothing that comes the day after that day. But again, we're just in chapter 11. We're only halfway through. There's another 11 chapters to go. Okay, fast forward to chapter 14. That we did seal 6, we did trumpet 7. Here's chapter 14. This is going to be bowl number 7. Bowl of wrath number 7. Oh, wait, no, sorry. That's coming in the next one. This is before we get to bowl number 7. This is the harvest of the earth in chapter 14. Okay. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud. Seated up on the cloud was one like a son of man. We heard about that in our message this morning. And we talked about it a lot in Sunday school this morning too. Was one like a son of man with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. What happens on the day after the earth is harvested? Know the answer. There is no day after the day that the earth is harvested. Verse 17, another angel came down from the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had, how many angels have we? You better count them. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called out in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung his sickle on the earth and gathered its grapes and threw them into the winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horse's bridle for a distance of 1,600 stadia. What happens on the day after that happens? There's no, that is the end of this world as we know it. Are we counting? That's number 3. Here comes chapter 16. The 7th angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, "It is done." Then there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. We have seen that before, haven't we? No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on the earth. So tremendous was the quake, and the great city split into 3 parts. The cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky, huge hailstones weighing about 100 pounds each fell on people, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible. That's the 7th bowl. What happens on the day after the 7th bowl? There is no day after the 7th bowl. That's the end, from a different perspective, from a different angle. Chapter 18. Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone, and he threw it into the sea, and with such violence the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. Babylon is destroyed. Now, Babylon, this is in chapter 18, verse 21. And the rest of chapter 18 before that, it was this large description of Babylon, and it said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. But before chapter 18 was chapter 17. And in chapter 17, we see that there is a harlot, and she's got a big booty because she sits on 7 hills. Now, what else sat on 7 hills? City of Rome sits on 7 hills. So that harlot is an actual city of Rome, but John doesn't name her Rome. He says that she is the city of Babylon, and a harlot, a prostitute, mother of prostitutes. So is she Rome? Is she a harlot? Is she Babylon? Yes. There's how those symbols work. Now, in the next few chapters, we're going to see another woman, not clothed in red, not a harlot, but a bride clothed in white. And we find out that that bride is also a city of her own, a New Jerusalem. You see, I talked last week about symbolic foils and how a bad image is an opposite of a good image. And so the harlot is the opposite of the bride. The city of Babylon is the opposite of the New Jerusalem. They're both women, they're both cities, and they both are wearing something that represents their character. All those parallels there. But this is the end of the harlot Babylon image. Then we get to chapter 19. Then I saw a beast and kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider of the horse, on the horse, and his army. Now, earlier in chapter 19, we were introduced to the rider, and he has on his thigh, it says King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So who's that? That's Jesus. And there's a sword coming out of his mouth, just like there was a sword coming out of his mouth back in chapter 1. And on his head, he's crowned with many crowns. So there's Jesus. Verse 20, the beast was captured, and with it the false prophets. Those are the 2 other bad guys, the beast, the false prophet, and we've already seen the harlot. So now the beast and the false prophet, who had performed signs on its behalf. With these signs, he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The 2 of them, the beast and the false prophet, are thrown alive into the lake of fire, a fiery lake of burning sulfur. The rest were killed with the sword coming out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, and the birds gorged themselves on their flesh. There's 2 dinners in chapter 19. You're invited. There's a wedding feast of the Lamb, and there's the buzzard feast. Which dinner do you want to go to? Because you're coming to dinner in chapter 19. That's how these images are being used. Just like there was a good woman and a bad woman, and a good city and a bad city, and there's the beast wears crowns, but the rider on the white horse wears crowns, and there's a good feast and there's a bad feast. That's what's going on in this book. So there's the end from another angle, the end from the angle of watching the end of the beast and the false prophet. Then we get to chapter 20. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city that he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Again, we see the destruction of the dragon in chapter 20. Okay, now, has anybody been counting? How many times did the world end? Want to take a guess? 7 times. I pointed out a few weeks ago that there are 7 blessings, 7 beatitudes that are sprinkled throughout the whole book of Revelation. And there is also the end of the earth that appears 7 times sprinkled throughout the book of Revelation. So what does that tell us? It tells us intensifying repetition. We call it recapitulation. Intensifying repetition. There it is. So the idea of Revelation is it's bad. It's going to get worse. You better hold on tight. But he's going to win. Would you like me to tell you again? Would you like me to tell you 7 times? And depending on where your ticket is, you get to see it from a different angle. You might see it from the angle of the seals. You might see it from the angle of the trumpets. You might see it from the angle of the bowls. You might see it from the angle of the harvest of the earth. You might see it from the angle of the destruction of the harlot. You might see it from the angle of the destruction of the beasts. You might see it from the angle of the destruction of Satan. But it's all the same event. You just got different seats to see it from different angles. It's recapitulation. It's the same story being told over and over and over again. And again, why didn't he just say, it's bad, it's going to get worse, you better hang on, but we're going to win in the end? Because he's Jewish. That's not how they tell stories. And that's not how they write apocalypses. That's okay. So you want to, like, here we are in lesson 6, and I finally told you what the book of Revelation is about. But we had to do a lot of work to get here. But now you can see this is what the whole book is about. Now, at this point, if you understand this, the book of Revelation is not nearly as scary as it was 7 weeks ago. It's not really that scary. It's John. I'm just blown away at the creative mind of John. And the creative mind of the Holy Spirit inspiring John to give us this elaborate way of making this giant point so that we could understand it's bad, it's going to get worse, we better hold on, but he's going to win in the end. Because that is the message that we heard 7 times from 7 different angles. That's Revelation. Now that we know that, we can go back. And so next week, we're going to pick up in chapter 4 and 5. So we've already covered chapters 1, 2, and 3, if you've been keeping track. I've given you a lot of material out of chapter 1. We've studied the visions of Jesus. You've done some homework on chapter 1. We've covered chapter 1 pretty well. We covered chapter 2 and chapter 3 pretty well as we've looked through the 7 letters to the 7 churches. I gave you a pretty cool handout that shows you the parallelisms. Now, from this point, we're going to turn a corner in our class. And now that we know the big idea of the book, we can start walking our way through significant chunks. So we're going to do chapter 4 and 5. Then we're going to do something a little bit different, a little out of order. I'm going to create another chart of the series of 7s, just like I created for the 7 churches. I'm going to create a chart for the series of 7s, looking at the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. And again, if you want to work ahead, if you want to have a lot of fun, knock yourself out, create that ahead of me. See, and we'll compare notes. Maybe you find something that I don't find. It'll be great. But we're going to compare that. And then we're going to look at chapters 10 and 11. Then we'll look at chapters 12 and 13, 14 and 15, 16. Then we'll look at 17 and 18 together, 19 and 20 together, and then we'll look at 21 and 22 together. And what we will find in all of those pieces is that big overall message. It's bad. It's going to get worse. You better hold on tight but he's going to win. That's what we're going to find the rest of the book. And it's not nearly as scary as we might have thought it was 7 weeks ago. So here is a bird's eye view of the book of Revelation. I should have pulled this up as I was just talking. This would have been really helpful to me in the last 2 minutes that I was speaking here. So that's what we're going to look at. Chapter 1, we saw the introduction and opening vision of Jesus. Chapter 2 and 3, the 7 letters to 7 churches. Chapter 4 and 5, the worship around the throne in heaven. We're going to draw heaven next week. And Miss Mary is going to help us. She has a plethora of crayons. You're going to get a little box of crayons, and I'm going to bring all the colored markers that I have, and we're going to draw heaven in chapter 4 and 5. So your one side of your note page is just going to be big and blank for us to just draw together. If you want to work ahead, do it. Read chapter 4 and 5. And in fact, your homework for this week, I'll get to it at the end, but your homework is to read chapter 4 and 5 and look toward images that are kind of expressing the themes that we celebrate for Good Friday and for Easter. I wanted to give you some devotional homework as we think about Easter coming up. But maybe this will give you a little tease to come back even next Sunday on Easter. If you don't, it's okay. I still love you. And you can catch the video, and we'll upload the pictures of drawing heaven in Revelation. Okay. Chapter 6 is the judgment of, now chapter 6 only has 6 of the 7 of the seals. There's an 8th seal that doesn't appear down to chapter 8. We'll look at worshiping in heaven as we pause the seals before we get to seal number 7. That appears at the beginning of 8. And then the rest of chapters 8 and 9 are 6 of the 7 trumpets. But we pause at number 6 and we go into 7 thunders, a prophecy scroll that is swallowed and can't be opened, 2 witnesses. And then at the end of 11 is the 7th trumpet that we looked at a moment ago. And chapter 12 is the introduction of the dragon. In chapter 13 is the introduction of the beasts. In chapter 14, the good worship in heaven, bad worship on earth. Also the introduction of Babylon, and the harvest of the earth is in chapter 14. And then we have chapter 15 and 16, 7 bowls of judgment. There is a tiny little pause between number 6 and number 7, but it's a shorter pause. In chapter 17, the fall of the harlot. Chapter 18, the fall of Babylon. Chapter 19, the bride, but the fall of the beast and the two dinners, the 2 feasts. Chapter 20 is the fall of Satan and the reign of Christ. And then chapter 21 and 22, the new heavens and the new earth. So I want to point out another fun little nugget that points us to significant moments in the structure. Now, you observed that there are a lot of series of 7s. And just a moment ago, I was explaining that there's this weird timeout. He gets to seal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. End of chapter 6. Now chapter 7, timeout. Then we get to chapter 8, verse 1, seal 7. Now there's something going on with that. Seals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 appears in chapter 6, verses 1 through 17. But before we get to seal number 7, over in chapter 8, verse 1, we have a vision of heaven where there are 144,000 who are sealed. And if you're paying close attention, back in seal number 6, it said, the great day of the wrath of the Lamb has come, and who can stand? Guess what the 144,000 are doing? They're standing. They're the answer to the question. Because it's bad, it's going to get worse. You better hold on tight, because he's going to win in the end. And what are those 144,000 doing? They're the ones who held on tight. So you can too. You can too. But we'll unpack that in more detail later as we get there. But that's the idea. They're the answer to the question, who can stand? They're the ones who are standing. Why 144,000? Those symbolic numbers that we talked about a few weeks ago. Symbolic numbers. We've got 12, number of God's people, times 12, number of all God's people. Multiply them together. 12 squared is 144, times 1,000. All God's people, all God's people, all God's people, all God's people. Why didn't he just say all God's people? Because he's Jewish. And he's writing an apocalypse. And they love symbolic numbers. Yeah. Okay, well, then let's look at the trumpets. If you look in chapter 8, verse 1, really verse 2, all the way to chapter 9, verse 21, you will see trumpets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then time out. Here comes chapter 10 and chapter 11. There's a little typo here. It's chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 14. I see I made a little typo. Through chapter 11, verse 14. And in that, there are 7 thunders. What's in those? I don't know. It's sealed. We don't find out. But did you count? We have 7 seals, 7 thunders, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, for that number of completion on earth. But the trumpets, the thunders, we never find out what's in them. Again, put that on your timeline, right? If someone is going to like make a timeline to try to figure out where all of this goes in some kind of chronological order, one, they have to ignore the fact that the world ends 7 times, and they have to figure out something needs to keep happening after the world ended in chapter 6. But then where do you put the events of the 7 thunders that we don't know about? What's the point of 7 thunders that we don't know about? It's to remind us that there are judgments that we don't know about. We don't get to know everything that happens. And you know what? That kind of makes sense because it's bad. It's going to get worse. So you better hold on tight, but he's going to win in the end. I bet that something about that theme is what's hiding inside the 7 thunders, because that's what's hiding everywhere else. Okay, so then we get after the 7 thunders, then there's also 2 witnesses. We'll talk about those guys. Again, those 2 witnesses are very much like the 144,000 because they're another answer of who can stand. The two witnesses can stand. So sometimes you might feel like you're a part of 144,000 and you're standing with all of God's saints together and there's solidarity and yeah, we all made it. And some days you might feel like it's just you and a buddy against the world. Why? Because it's bad. It's going to get worse, so you better hold on tight, but he's going to win in the end. And then we get the trumpet number 7 in chapter 11 as the verse that we looked at the end of the world. Then there's bowls. 1 through 6 appears in chapter 16, verses 1 through 14. And then time out. Verse 15. These are red letters in my Bible. Now, the red letters, again, are not inspired. They came even later than the chapter breaks and verse breaks. But look, I come like a thief. Blessed, there's a beatitude, blessing. Blessed is the one who stays awake, hold on tight, remains clothed, so as, there's a typo there too, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. There's that message, you better hold on tight. And that little timeout is really telling us the exact same message of the 2 witnesses and of the 144,000. But do you see that we look at it at a different angle, and you could say that as this is being repeated, it is intensifying. We get a shorter little timeout here. And then again, when we look at the big picture, as the big dogs go down, the harlot and Babylon, they are destroyed. The harlot, by the way, I mentioned earlier that Babylon is destroyed when an angel throws a millstone into the sea that destroys Babylon. The chapter before that, in chapter 17, the harlot is destroyed. You know how she's destroyed? She's eaten by the beast. An evil force destroys another evil force. Have you seen that in our world? Have you ever seen an evil force? Like the beast is an image of persecution and violence. But the harlot is an image of seduction and materialism and sexual immorality. Have you ever seen evil forces of violence take down other evil forces of materialism and seduction? It might look something like a religion that follows a violent prophet trying to knock down big buildings that are economic centers. I'm not saying that chapter 17 of Revelation is a prophecy of 9/11. I'm saying that 9/11 happens. It's part of history where the beasts, the images of violence, take down images of seduction, of materialism and sexual immorality. And often when we see one evil force attack another evil force, the people of the Lamb try to figure out which side they're supposed to be on in this conflict. And the answer is you're already on a side, you're on the Lamb's side. So when you see one evil force attack another evil force, just know this is the world unfolding the way that the world has always unfolded. And you don't need to try to be on a side. You be on the Lamb's side. And on the Lamb's side, we go and share the grace of Jesus with that false religion that follows violence. And we go and share the grace of Jesus with people who put too much hope in their economic worth. And we bind up the sick, and we care for the wounded, and we love the survivors because we're the people of the Lamb. That's a perspective on history. That's what Revelation. So when I talked about how earlier that Revelation speaks to our world today, that's what I'm talking about. It speaks to our world today, but not in trying to predict our headlines, but in how we see the world unfolding from a spiritual perspective, from heaven's point of view. It might have felt like the end of the world if you were in Manhattan on that day. Probably felt like the moon was turning to blood and stars were falling to the earth and a great earthquake and hailstorms. It probably felt like that on that day. And if that was where your seat was, you got to see a little taste of the end from that perspective, but it's gonna keep happening. We're unfolding this human history in different ways, and we're seeing it at different angles. And if you were there in Manhattan, you experienced that it was bad. And you experience that it's going to get worse. You experience that you better hold on tight because he's going to win in the end. That's a different way of understanding 9/11. But I think that's what it looks like through the lens of a book like Revelation. You get the timeout in chapter 19 is the wedding feast of the Lamb before it times back in to see the judgment of beasts and Satan. And this last bottom line here, I'm going to take it and flip it sideways to show you that we have another chiasm, that the bad guys are introduced. A dragon, two beasts, and the Babylon, who is the harlot. They are introduced. And then who is destroyed first? The Babylon the Great is introduced in chapter 14. In between that is the seven bowls, that final image of the series of seven judgments. But then after the seven bowls comes chapter 17 and 18, where Babylon is destroyed. She was introduced last, she's destroyed first. And then the two beasts are destroyed in chapter 19. They were introduced in the middle and they are destroyed in the middle. And then in chapter 19, the dragon who was introduced first back in chapter 12 is destroyed last in chapter 20. And in the middle of all of that is this seven bowls of judgment that are poured out. Do you see the pattern? We came full circle. And so it's the end, is the introduction and the end. When was the dragon introduced? Before human history begins. When is the beast introduced? As soon as human history begins. It might look a little bit like a dragon saying, doesn't that fruit, maybe the dragon that looks like a tiny dragon, you might call him a serpent, saying that fruit is pleasing to the eye and good for food and desirable. It might look like a dragon that says, kill your brother in the field because you're not his keeper. And that looks like violence, Cain and Abel. Or it might look like Build a tower up to heaven and make a great name for yourself in the tower. When did the beast begin? As soon as we fell, there's been a beast. The beast has always been there. And the beast lives alive and well in the first century, and he looks like Domitian. But the beast has been alive and well in every generation of Christians. And some days he looks like Mao, and some days he looks like Putin, and some days he looks like Hitler, and then some days he looks like American slaveholders. Beasts that dehumanize people with violence to force their will on other people. The beast has always been there. And what about the false prophet? Looks like a serpent taking God's word and twisting it. It's always been there. What does the false prophet look like today? Where do we have people that are acting like prophets but are lying and twisting God's word? Where do we not? We could talk about media, we could talk about false religions, we could talk about false philosophies that are taking bits of truth and twisting it. And people are separated from Jesus because they're following those lies, just like they've always been separated from God by following a twisting of his word, like his word was twisted in the garden to separate his people from his presence. And what about that harlot? When did she appear? She's eternal too. Some days she looks like Jezebel. Some days she looks like the Bachelor. Some days she looks like what's accepted as normal in high school. And we've got the harlot that is seducing and drawing people away from the Lamb, from God. She's always been there. And in the first century, she looked like the sexual immorality, and she looked like the materialism that existed in the Roman Empire. And she looks just like the sexuality and the materialism that exists in the American Empire. And honestly, I think one of the main reasons why we don't see so much of the beast persecuting in America, there's a little bit of beast persecuting in America, but too many Christians are ready and willing to line up for the harlot. That's how we see the world through the lens of Revelation. And so when will the harlot be destroyed? Well, some days the beast takes her down. Someday an angel throws a millstone in the sea, but eventually it's bad. It's going to get worse. You better hold on, because he's going to win in the end. And then eventually the same thing will happen to the dragon. He will be defeated. He's existed before our history. He will be defeated in the end. And it's the same message. That's the message of the book of Revelation. So here's the conclusion to wrap everything up. Revelation is written with a cyclical, recapitulating structure that communicates symbolic meaning of the total destruction of evil and God's preservation of his saints and Jesus' ultimate victory. I never had it on your notes, but I hope that somewhere in the margin you wrote, it's bad, it's going to get worse. You better hold on tight, because he's going to win in the end. That's really what it all comes down to. That's the book of Revelation. And it's not nearly as scary, and it's not predicting our headlines, but it is the world that we live in, is it not? It is the world that we live in. That's what Revelation is about. And it totally filters and changes how we understand the world that we live in. So I hope I see you next week. If not, that's okay. Enjoy Easter with your family. But sometime between now and next week, I encourage you to read chapter 4 and 5 and ask what words, what phrases jump out with themes that are celebrating what we celebrate at Good Friday and on Easter Sunday. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Love you, and I hope that you have a great night.